Hi, my name is Larissa, and I'm the president of UQ Biotech Society. Today, three representatives from our team are privileged to conduct an interview with Professor Trent Munro and to explore the emerging industry opportunities here in Australia biotech sector. So thank you for being with us here, Trent. And why don't you start by sharing your current role as Chair of Life Science Queensland and also the GM from Biopharmaceutical Innovation Precinct?
Thanks very much. Look, real pleasure to be here and talk about biotechnology today. It's definitely one of my favorite subjects. So yeah, as you mentioned, so these days I do a few different things, three things primarily. One, I'm the chair of Life Sciences Queensland, which is the peak body for all things life science, which includes biotechnology here in Queensland. Two, I've recently taken on a role as the general manager for the Boggo Road Innovation Precinct, and I think we'll talk more about that later. And then three, I also have a role with the University of Queensland where I'm an industry professor and support some strategic things we're thinking about of how we approach biotechnology as a whole for the university.
Well, that's definitely a long list of roles we're going to explore. Why don't we start with, from your perspective as the chair of Life Science Queensland, can you give us an overview on how the industry is doing at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think there are a couple of really complicated factors at play. So if we look internationally or globally at the biotech sector, we definitely see a change. And I think the change is probably that biotechnology has matured into a different phase of its time. And that commercially is changing things. We're seeing some tightness in the capital markets for how startups are supported. We're seeing different types of strategic decisions that big biotech and pharma are making. So that's kind of new. If we think about things more locally here in Australia, it continues to be an area where I think we've got to grow. I think the biotech sector as a whole is still too small in Australia. It needs to be an area of focus, and we've got big opportunity. If we then come to Queensland, if we look at what's happened over, I'd say the last 3 decades almost, that's a long time, so 30 years, we've really seen a huge amount of growth from where we were, growing our universities, growing our research, and now we've got a fairly vibrant startup community. And that's an opportunity for us to foster that. It's also an opportunity for us to make sure we have ways of bringing more players here, both nationally and internationally, to come to Queensland to call it home and grow the biotech sector here. Some of the commercial exits and deals that are happening, I think that's pretty vibrant for us. It's a really positive opportunity. The gap, I think, is making sure that as we scale those companies and they have ideas to grow, that we find good places for those companies to operate. That's been a real challenge is, if you're a company of 2 or 3, it's pretty easy. If you want to be a company of, 5, 10, 20 to 100 plus, it's pretty hard to find really good places to be at the moment. So that's a challenge.
Right. So to elaborate on this point, you were saying for small scale companies, it's likely for them to still survive and thrive in the Australian sector. But for them to expand to the next phase in their business, there are more tangible challenges such as?
Yeah, look, I think the challenge, there's probably multiple challenges. One, there's always the challenge of fundraising, but that's universal. There's the challenge of talent. What kind of talent do you need? What kind of staff are you looking for to grow the company? And then there's the location challenge. Where am I going to put that company that makes it economically viable, that I can have good lab space or office space or whatever the mix of need is, and to exist here. Of course, there are bigger challenges around, if a company wants to keep, say, manufacturing here locally, whatever type of manufacturing that is, that can be a challenge. I mean, the one example is probably, Vaxxus as a company here that, started, quite a while ago now, as a few people at University of Queensland in the Australian Institute of Bioengineering and Nanotechnology, was able to find some excellent space where we are here today at the Translational Research Institute in its ability to host corporate entities here. And its scale meant that now it's had to move over to North Shore in a retrofitted building there. But even for them, while that's a fantastic facility and allows them to do what they need to do, they're kind of isolated from the rest of the community. And wouldn't have been great to have the opportunity to make sure they continue to be surrounded by other relevant businesses. That's just one piece, but it's a good example.
That's a very interesting point of view as well. However, jumping things to a broader perspective, how would you describe the influence of the local industry here? Has that affected its standing in the Asia Pacific region?
Look, I would say that we're still very early. We're still very early. If you look in the Asia Pacific region, I always use examples like South Korea, which have had a really incredibly focused effort that biotechnology is a core part of their economy. They've attracted a lot of international companies to come there, or they've grown their own companies at incredible scale. Like Samsung Biologics, for example, just an incredible growth story in terms of what they're able to do from a manufacturing point of view, and then they're a massive employer as well, and they've done that many times over. Obviously we use the example of Singapore, where many companies have come to set up mainly for manufacturing because of cost, because they can do things in a more efficient way there based on tax policies and other things, and workforce. And there are other examples. Japan's done a really great job. Australia, I think, has a massive opportunity that we haven't capitalized on to be a trusted partner in that ecosystem. But it's early days. It's early days. So, it's the same story that we've talked about for a little while, that, outside of CSL, as a major innovative company, it's in our top 5 in the ASX from a value point of view. We need more companies. And there's a number of really good stories. But even CSL at the moment is having its own challenges and having to make some difficult business decisions to try and evolve.
Yeah. Seems like there's a lot Australia can learn from other countries on policy making. But speaking of growth, this year has been quite a lean for the local life science industry, from the acquisition of Vice Bio from Sanofi to the announcement of a new manufacturing facility entry, which is launching next year. From your angle, Trent, how would you describe these separate events, and would they make substantial impacts on the industry?
Yeah, okay, so let's take the example of Vice Bio first, simply because I've had a chance to work with that technology, and of course I know the founders very well. It's an amazing example for Australia and for Queensland. And I think it's unique and probably different to many other examples that we've had. And the reason is because the fundamental idea for the technology and the platform was all invented here at University of Queensland by Keith Chappell and Dan Watterson and Paul Young, who worked on it for many years with very little funding. And it was their ability to form a company and get support for that company that has led to this acquisition. The price point for the acquisition is such that the value to a company like Sanofi it must be incredibly high. For them to pay over $1 billion up front means they've got big plans for this. We don't know what that is. They'll do what they want to do, but it's just an incredible story. And I guess the other piece is that a lot of the research work to validate that platform was also done here locally. Now, that's not to take away from the amazing work that the Vice Bio team has done. Of course, once they invested, Vice Bio was actually a European company, and most of the capital, the funding for Vice Bio also came internationally. So, that's a story for another time perhaps, but it speaks to the challenge of us finding capital here locally. But the outcome's amazing. It shows that we can do world-class research and translational activities here, and that can lead to huge outcomes. I think we can do that many, many times over. So, it's just an example. The other example is what's trying to fill a gap in the market, and that is the entry facility, of which was previously known as TRI2 or TM at TRI, and is now entry or entering translation. I think I've got that right. And that is a gap that we've seen over and over again, where it's really hard for companies to do the early stage manufacturing or prototyping. And so the unique model of entry is that companies will come and use that facility and take advantage of the wraparound infrastructure, but bring their own equipment and ideas and be able to do that at a much lower cost than they would, for example, if they had to go and build their own facility. And that's the goal and the really unique thing around entry. And there are many people wanting to do that. I wouldn't even be surprised if we saw, some really interesting international companies come and access entry, just because of the unique value proposition that it brings. And so I think we're all looking forward to that opening in 2026. And I had a chance to tour the building a few weeks ago, and it's going to be an amazing facility.
Yeah. It seems like entry is meant for small-scale production and also initial scaled-up investigation, perhaps. Would you say the next stage for the manufacturing field to look at would be some, more demanding manufacturing facility?
Yeah, look, the way I think about it, and I think I said entering translation before, it's enabling translation, just to be clear. So, for entry, look, I think the way that it works is that manufacturing is just different every time, and every company is going to have to make their own choices on what they can do early in their development, in the middle of their development, and late in development. Yeah. What's really clear is that to do manufacturing for early clinical trials, you need to be flexible, you need to do it cost efficiently, you need to do it quickly, and so I think entry fits that bill really well. I think doing more sophisticated manufacturing for later scale up, that'll be a case-by-case basis. So not everything will fit the entry mold, but I think there's, it's got everything that you would need for a broad spectrum of ideas and products. And we'll see how that evolves. I mean, the other piece for entry is just to say that, there's going to be a proportion of that building which is left for, uses that we don't know yet. And so it's not all locked, which is great. So, if the right project comes along or the right client or the right idea, the building can be repurposed to meet that need.
Right, that's such an insightful opinion. Well, moving on.
Yes.
According to the 2025 Brisbane State of the City report, Brisbane is now ranked in the top 40 out of the 10,000 cities for its innovation and startup. Needless to say, this is such a heartfelt encouragement to all of us in the field. However, there will still be major challenges in future. And how would you address some limitations the field is facing right now?
Yeah, so let's just take one thing in context. So, I've lived in Brisbane on and off for quite a while. It's going through an incredible change, and I think you mentioned some numbers there, and I think the Brisbane Economic Development Agency has done a fantastic job over the last couple of years with the State of the City report to crystallise those opportunities, whether it be population growth, size of economy, where we sit in the innovation spectrum. All of those things are the ingredients for future success. And then we keep talking about 2032, and that Brisbane becoming a world city based on being able to host the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So they're the positive drivers. And so I think that creates, really, we should think without limitation. We can do it here. Whatever we want to do here, we can do it here. Yeah. So what are the challenges? Well, anything you do in the innovation space is generally high risk, which means of however many, of the 100 projects that start, only a few will reach the finish line. And I think sometimes we don't have the right risk appetite here locally. Yeah. And we get surprised when things fail, or we get surprised when plans change, whether it be a company's plans or a drug candidate. But we shouldn't be surprised. We should celebrate both successes and also the times where things didn't go to plan.
And lesson learned.
And that's where I think other areas, particularly I use the example of the US mainly because I've got a lot of experience there, where people learn from that initial attempt and then they continue to build and evolve. And I think that's something we need to do. And then the other very basic thing is that we need a better diversified capital pool here. We need better ways to fund things, and all too often we're trying to do things on the cheap. What does it take to take an idea into a clinical trial? What does that really cost to do that at world standard? Yeah. Sometimes we're not very realistic about that. So massive opportunity. Couple of challenges there, maybe some cultural challenges, maybe some financial challenges. But I also think they're things that can be solved.
Are there any international models Queensland can look to for inspiration?
Yeah, so I think the one piece, and it's both a Queensland thing and a national thing, is that, and I think I've written this a number of times, that when we look internationally for people who've done this well, and maybe you could take China as an example, or the UK as an example, or the US as an example, they recognize the criticality of something like biotechnology as a national priority. And so while we put it on lists in Australia and maybe mention it, I don't think we've developed the policy framework to truly live what that means by establishing our own capability here, backing companies here. And so, in Queensland, we can do the same thing. So just recently, for example, the government has launched an initiative called the Sovereign Industry Development Fund. I think it's around $180 million. That's a great scheme. It's going to sit across the priority areas of biomedical, biofuels, and defense. They're three broad areas that I think, biotechnology plays a really important role. So, stimulus like that's important. Ensuring that we're globally competitive for opportunities when they come, and that we can compete to bring those opportunities here. And then recognizing when our local industry needs specific support. Maybe that's figuring out how to support some infrastructure development, whether that's figuring out how to help them access an export market. Those are the things where government can play a role. What I think we shouldn't expect is government just to subsidize the industry. Yeah. That's not the role of government necessarily. In some very specific areas, they do that because there's gaps in the private market. But we know biotechnology is a commercial enterprise, yeah. And so we've got to be out there finding that commercial money to drive things forward, of which there's plenty. But those other pieces, I think, are where the role of government works well. I mean, one more point is to say that where it works best is where you get different groups working together holistically, yeah. With a shared vision. So, whether it's the universities, whether it's the industry, or whether it's government, all those people working together is where it all hums.
I reckon this point you share might be echoing to compare with other countries who are doing pretty well in biotechnology. Maybe these policies are what Australia are lacking at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I use the example in the US around manufacturing, for example. They've recognized that they've got a really incredible workforce in some areas like Ohio and North Carolina, just as two examples. There are many others where companies have now established really significant manufacturing bases in the US because of the environment, because of the availability of space, because of what's happening there. And now that's a huge part of the local economies there. An incredible number of high-skilled jobs, from on the manufacturing floor to management to quality systems to logistics. It's changed the game in some of those communities. I think we could do those sort of similar things here, yeah. But it takes a risk appetite. It takes incredible support, alignment between the state governments and the federal governments to bring that to fruition. And it's not a one and done. Example here in Australia that obviously we saw a gap during the pandemic.
Well, that's a great example you put out there. Just to switch the angle from a student's perspective, it is inevitable that the job market is quite tight at the moment. And would you like to address that? Is it the market is being more competitive and thus require a higher labor force? Or has there been a shift in labor demand from one sector to the other?
Look, I think the labour situation has definitely changed. I mean, a few years ago, it felt like people could really pick and choose what they wanted, and it was really it seemed like there was a lot of jobs around. Globally, I think that's changed. The challenge we have here again locally is just scale. So a lot of the job opportunities we have sit outside of the R&D space. There are only a few companies here locally that are really doing true R&D type roles that are really, for someone who wants a hybrid type position where they're still interested in research or working on the bench, they exist, but there's not so many of them. Many more of the opportunities are in sort of the services or support sectors, whether that be in companies who sell products here, like big distributors like Thermo or Cytiva or Sartorius or others who sell into the biotech sector. They're always looking for good people to help with their product portfolios, help partner with the local industry, but that's not a straight R&D role. Of course, we would love to see those companies expand here and bring that R&D function. That's something I think we'd all love to see. And I think they'd like to see it too, because it could be a support for the rest of the rest of Asia. We're strategically positioned. So those are the types of roles that are typically around. And the other thing I would say for students is it's just really important to understand what the company does here. Yeah. And so, typically when you see the name of the company, you're like, oh, it must have all these amazing jobs. But you've really got to say, okay, what is the function of that company here? What's their Australian operations doing? If I want to stay here, then what is that? The only last thing I would say is that for a number of those companies, if you start here in Australia, you can also get an opportunity elsewhere. Once if you're contributing to the company, you're delivering on what they need, then, doors open. And they can open all around the place.
That's such a good piece of advice.
Yeah.
Just to elaborate on one point you shared there, you mentioned there are, in Australia, just based on the nature of the market composition, it seems like R&D job is not as vibrant here compared to other countries. However, on the manufacturing field or some analyticals field, those are the areas that are blooming and might potentially require more labor. Would you recommend any other blooming field that would require more laborers in future?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer because I think it's hard to have that crystal ball. We could talk about some really hard trends that typically being data savvy. That's going to be really important. I think where a lot of industries are changing very, very quickly. We don't know how that's exactly going to play out. I'm not going to spend any time talking about AI, but things are changing from a labour force requirement. So I think being aware of that. The other thing is I think just be kind of open-minded when you think about those roles and what you can contribute to them. Yeah. So what are the really important skills? There's some really basic things around work ethic, being able to have great communication skills, being able to deliver, project plans, some high-level things that if done well, you become a really attractive candidate. Yeah. Yes, some jobs will have very specific technical requirements, but typically, I'd say being a bit more rounded in your approach. I guess my other advice to students, and I said this maybe before, is just to really understand the role. Yeah. Do a little bit of research on the company, figure out what they want, and then maybe even look a little bit what they're doing outside of Australia. Say, is this the company that I could see myself in, or is it a stepping stone? Yeah. What's my motivation for the role?
Speaking about the R&D role, yeah. I wanted to take this thought into science. Yeah. More specifically, in the point of view of the researchers, sure. What exactly is some of the blind spots that researchers often miss during their experimentations, which have a heavy impact on their end result?
Yeah, look, great to talk about science after all of that. So I think one of the blind spots is that typically from a research point of view, we get really, really focused on the biology, which at the end of the day is critical. And so we might have a drug candidate and we figured out that it is able to do something really interesting in this pathway, and we think that could be important in this disease, right? That's typically the hypothesis. The blind spots are, well, what kind of drug or therapeutic do I think I could make from that? What kind of test could I make from that? What kind of device, whatever it is? What matters commercially? And some of the things that matter commercially are very different to what you typically think about as a researcher. So I always use the example of if you're going to develop let's say a monoclonal antibody as a drug product, and you've got this great molecule, it binds to the target really well, you get these fantastic biological readouts, but actually you didn't do any work on the protein engineering or looking at that molecule to check that it's stable, that you can make it at high yield so it's cost effective to manufacture. Those kind of really basic things can be the difference between a project that goes ahead and a project that's kind of killed. And so I think you need to think about some of those things. The other things that are typically blind spots are a bit more in the weeds, but they're things around, pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics, where, hey, where's my target in the body? How much dose do I think I'll need to actually give to cover the target to have a therapeutic impact? Did I pick the right modality? Should I have gone for a RNA or a protein or a cell therapy or a small molecule? What is it in the toolbox? So those things are typically blind spots because people just say, I've got an assay, I can show this, look, it's really important in this disease. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I think it is a good insight for early career professionals as well, who are like starting off with their research. So just wanted to understand your perspective on what skills should biotech professionals, especially starting off in their early career, should embody or it make them stand out today?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So a couple of things. One is probably if you're really interested in biotech, to do a bit of your homework on what is the biotech landscape. What does that actually look like? What are the themes that are happening out there in company land? What are the themes that are happening in startup land? So for example, spend some time like on Fierce Biotech as the website. Understand what kind of deals are getting done. Understand what kind of results are reading out. If you've got a bit of a holistic view of what that means from an industry perspective, you're going to stand out, I think, from the crowd. The second piece is probably, your phenotype and being flexible. So realizing that your first job or the first role may not be the perfect one, but have a long-term view. And it may sound a little bit silly to say, but if you are the type of person that can just get into a role and deliver on the goals for that role, and you can define what they are, you'll find that you'll move very, very quickly in an organization. That's really different to a research role where you're in the lab, you're just focused on your research, you can be very selfish around what that looks like. That's typically not the way things work in industry. So just those couple of small things can help you stand out from the pack.
Right. To even develop more on your thoughts on modern labor, Trent, would you like to share your thoughts on the productivity and performance on the workforce these days?
Yeah. So I think whenever there's challenges to the economy and people are a little bit worried about where things are going, one of the levers that they think about pulling is productivity. And what does that mean? It means to be more efficient in the daily activities so that the output per worker is higher. Obviously, there's been a big discussion here recently. I think, roundtable, the federal government convened a week or two ago. Obviously, I wasn't there, so I can't speak. I don't have the inside word on all of that. I can only go on some of the things that were in the public domain. And it felt like, to me, it was a bit of a missed opportunity to talk about the role of research and the role of thinking about how R&D fits into productivity. So what stat do we use typically? Well, we typically say that Australia is not spending enough on R&D compared to the OECD average or other benchmark comparators like let's say it's Korea or Japan or America. But actually what that means is that it means that a lot of our companies are not investing in their own solutions. Whether it be our smaller companies or big companies, it seems like they're relying on other people's innovations rather than innovations from within or innovations invented in this country. Yeah. And so just a long-winded way of saying that, research and development, I think, is a really important part of the productivity story. It's one part, it's not all of it, but it's certainly an area that I think we can do a lot better on here if we look at our scorecard in Australia. It's definitely a gap.
It feels funny to hear because just previously you touched on how robust the R&D activity is in Australia, and it's really the manufacturing part and also securing capitals are one of the biggest challenges we're facing. But it seems like there's still a bit to catch up in the R&D sector.
Yeah, I think a lot of our R&D is sort of focused in government-funded R&D in the universities. Yeah. So I think the maturation of that is probably what we need. Yeah. And there's a lot of great schemes where academic research can work together with industry research to deliver fantastic outcomes. So I think that's a big area. I know that's something that is a goal of the universities. There, people have got to make sure they're talking the right language. Something we talk about at University of Queensland quite a lot is rather than doing research and then trying to figure out where to put it, invite industry in, listen to their challenges, and then figure out how we've got smart solutions to solve it. Changing that whole paradigm, which I think is happening, is really important. So so look, R&D, lots of smart people, lots of great ideas. We need to just keep those going and keep the investment going into companies and make sure they're doing that.
Right. Just before we move on to the next topic, I do want to share as a student that we have observed a phenomenon in the field, and there is existing multinational companies like Merck, Sanofi, and Sartorius, which are companies that actually have a physical office here. However, it is unclear that what their next development plan is. So as a biotech graduates, how should we see that?
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this, but typically for companies, let's say like a Merck or a Sartorius here locally, the vast majority of their activity is focused on sales. That's a different type of role, right? Because they are an important solutions provider into the sector. Most of the activity here is either in small companies or the universities. And so they need people who can know about the products and help people access them. And so their willingness to grow is basically bottom line driven based on what they deliver back from a sales perspective. Obviously if you grow the sales pipeline, that lets you do other strategic things because you'll be like, oh, you guys are knocking it out of the park there, you can do more things. And so that's been happening. I look at the significant examples, other examples here locally. Thermo, very large company. I think you guys have recently had a conversation with Kim Baker, who's the general manager of the Patheon facility here. It's an incredible story of what they're delivering. And I think that's a really good example. When those companies do invest here locally, they see really good outputs. But it's hard to predict their plans. What I said earlier is we'd love to try and encourage those companies to do a lot more here outside of the sales regime. Sanofi is a very different example because we have the translational science hub here that's been started. They've been growing their headcount over the last little while. They've got a new leader here locally, and he's got to set the agenda of where they're going. But the really interesting thing is that they're doing multiple things. So one is there's a pool of funding available for research and grants that are directly aligned to what Sanofi's directions are. That's great, so that opens up. They're doing clinical trials here with some innovative products, and then they're looking, okay, what's next? And that'll be a joint conversation around how to do that. But so they've been growing their footprint. I don't know what their headcount is at the moment. But yeah, they're not going to publish that, they're not going to publicize it. So sometimes it's about keeping your ear to the ground. Other companies like Telix, which I think is a really fantastic Australian company, they've got a pretty good presence here in Brisbane as well, doing regulatory work and other things. Advanced Cells got a manufacturing facility here. They've just had an incredible success with their recent fundraising. They're doing some really innovative R&D here. So it's happening. And so my advice to the students is, look at all those opportunities. Try and keep your ear to the ground. Obviously things like LinkedIn. And then there's all the recruiting sites. But when those opportunities come up, reach out to people and find out what they are.
Right. That's definitely a very helpful advice for students. Just before we end this interview, is there any other encouragement you would like to give to future biotech workforce?
Yeah, I think the most obvious thing to me now, I don't know if I'm entering a different phase in my career, but certainly feel like, that, the folks, the students today, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate or even, postdocs or researchers or people who've recently graduated, you guys are the ideas factory now. And so, I think you guys are the ones who are going to drive the future for locally here in Brisbane, in Queensland and Australia, and you've got to back your ideas. And I think it's up to people like us, probably put myself in the older category, to help that happen. And so, the only thing I would say is that there'll be a lot more coming out around what this Bogger Road Innovation Precinct actually is later this year. But the sole goal for me personally, the motivation for doing this role is that we grow this local ecosystem, with biotechnology being one of those growth areas. There's some other things we're interested in, but I want to see you guys starting the super successful companies of tomorrow, and the new Vice Bios and Vaxxuses and Microbas and Advanced Cells, all those companies. I mean, it'll be you guys that are doing it. That's the reality.
Wow, thank you for believing in us and also this generation. What an enriching section with Professor Trent here. And to all the future workforce out there, we hope you have learned a lot from this video. We are UQ BTS. Thanks for watching.